Hello, I'm Simon Alsop, the founder and head of Barrington James Board and Executive Partners. We are a global life science industry specialist executive search firm. We appoint board members and executives all across the globe from our offices in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Welcome to the CEO series, the series of podcasts in which we aim to uncover the secrets of successful leadership in the life science industry. And we'll do this by talking to some of the industry's most talented and progressive chief executives. And today, I'm delighted to welcome the CEO of Medigene, Selwyn Ho. Selwyn, hello.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for that introduction.
Welcome to the series. Yeah, so for those of you that don't know Selwyn already, I'll give a little introduction. Selwyn's brilliant career, which includes stints at Procter & Gamble, AstraZeneca, and Novartis, is for me a story of versatility. A qualified medical doctor, Selwyn has transitioned from frontline clinical medicine into industry, then from technical leadership into commercial, and finally from large pharma into biotech. Today, Selwyn is masterminding a strategic change at Medigene, the listed Munich-based immuno-oncology biotech. Selwyn is also currently an independent board director with Peptomic in Spain and the US-based Antinova. And if that wasn't enough, Selwyn is also an executive in residence with the VC firm New Rhine Healthcare. So, Selwyn, thanks for making time for us and welcome to the CEO series.
A pleasure. Thank you, Simon, for the invitation.
Great. So, Selwyn, as a start point to uncover, I guess, the influences that have created the leader you are today, I want to go right back to the start, talk about the formative experiences. So, who was the first boss that made a lasting impression on you?
Oh, I have to go right back to the start. So, I qualified in medicine in 1994. And I can remember at that time they used to call them house officers, if you remember the terminology. And so my very first, what they call firm, so you join a firm and it's led by a consultant, was led by a consultant physician called Richard Lancaster. And he was one of the most nicest and most erudite physicians ever had the pleasure to work with. And, the lasting impression for me was every single ward round and clinic that he used to run, he would come in impeccably dressed and always would wear a bow tie. And it's a classic old school, but he was just so erudite, so nice in the way that he would deal with the patients, teach us at the same time. He was always so patient with, these formative junior doctors who are trying to learn the ropes, and just made such a lasting impression on so many of my colleagues as well. It always used to be a very popular firm to choose if you could get onto Dr. Lancaster's rotation.
Brilliant. So, taught you perhaps the importance of high standards.
Absolutely.
High standards. Fantastic. If you think about your career as it's developed, Selwyn, who would you cite as any notable mentors you've had throughout?
Okay, so whilst I still was practicing medicine, I took a career more into, I'd say, the critical care side of things. So I actually did a stint in accident and emergency. And I did a rotation at one of the hospitals in London, and there was a very, very lovely gentleman called Sapal Tachakra, who was a consultant in accident and emergency. He was a fantastic teacher. And then following my transition into industry, I had a number of very memorable leaders who I learned so much from. So I'd say whilst I was at Novartis, a lady called Joanna Potts. While I was at Allergan, a gentleman called Paul Navarre.
Yeah.
Whilst I was at UCB, two very, very important people in my career, a gentleman called Mark McDade and Emmanuel K-Max. And then finally, most recently, I'd say when I joined Medigene, my previous incumbent CEO, who's now our CSO, Dolores Schendel, and the chair of our board, Gerd Zettelmeisel. All of these people have been absolutely amazing in giving me their time, their advice, their counsel, guiding me through each stage of my career with, their generosity as well.
Is there a consistent thread, Selwyn, across the majority of those people? So, i.e., a regular learning that you've had about how to lead, how to get the best out of people?
That's a good question. I'd say that there are definitely commonalities between how each and every one of them have approached. First of all, their generosity with their time and being able to feel supported is something that I've taken on board, which is, that same level of support that I've received is something that I should be giving as well to my
Yeah,
team.
yeah,
I'd say that's been a clear commonality. I've also had the misfortune of both having positive and negative business environments to deal with in each and every one of these scenarios. So you learn both sides of, when the going gets tough, sometimes that really brings out the character in people.
yeah.
And, learning from them how to navigate some of these very tricky times, whether it be general conflict management, whether it be having to look at downsizing, all of these kind of things. There's been a number of times where I've had to look at those throughout my career, and each and every time has been supported by these people as well.
You know what's interesting listening to you, Selwyn? We're of a similar vintage. You and I graduated around the same time as
You
you
obviously
did.
look much younger.
I'm not so sure about that, Selwyn. um, but I think growing up, my sort of idea of leadership, which perhaps I got from my parents and their generation, was, the boss tells you what to do and you don't challenge their authority. It's very much a directive. That's what you expect. But then when I went into work, as you discovered, it's a more supportive type of leadership that you get from most successful managers, and it was very different to what I expected when I first started work. So, without naming any names, Selwyn, can you think of a manager who showed you how not to do the job?
Oh yes. Let's try and keep this um, anonymous to protect the innocent. I can very specifically remember one manager who, let's say, could talk a great talk, but didn't quite walk the talk. And so for me, this is an issue around integrity,
Yeah,
um, which I think is incredibly important. The way I say to my team, and I say even to my kids, which is, I'm never going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't be prepared to do myself.
yeah, yeah. It's a great start point. Okay, great. When did you become a manager first, Selwyn?
Um, so if this was an interview, I'd obviously saying, oh, well, I started project managing and things like that. I would say in terms of line management, I took a role on when I started at Novartis. And I started taking on responsibilities for a marketing team.
Yeah,
And so that was my very first experience of line managing marketeers, which was quite interesting because if you looked at it on paper, I
yeah,
probably, technically speaking, had the least experience as a pure marketeer for that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. You've obviously evolved as a leader as you've gone through. Can you sort of summarize? I don't know. This, do you feel there are stages as you've gone through, or how's that played out?
I've taken, I suppose, a fairly deliberate approach. I know lots of people will say, "Well, you have to plan things," and other people say it's opportunistic. Things will happen for you. I think there's probably a balance, and there's no right or wrong way to do this. But I started off in a very classical route, which was to do R&D as soon as I moved into the industry, having come from a medical background. And so I started off as a study physician working on a clinical program. And I realized there's this strange thing called a business I'm working for, and that was quite important, the business. And actually, as you get to understand and learn that, the business is R&D, or the business is making medicines that will help people, you learn how intertwined and how important the collaboration is. So I thought it was really important to start to understand the business more and more. I could understand how to do clinical trials, I could understand the product. That's all technical stuff. That's like learning from medical school and understanding that there's an endpoint you'd want to get to. But the business was this, ooh, it's quite interesting. So probably focused more on the initially the interfaces, let's say, between R&D and the commercial organizations, and then realized that there's more and more things. So first of all, then moved into a medical affairs type role, which I think is a great juncture between the commercial and the R&D organization. And then realized, well, there's the actual pure commercial organization, and the biggest links that medical affairs groups generally have would be with the sales teams and the marketing and market access teams. So by definition, I then started moving into some of those as I learned more and more about their roles. So, and then as you build up the experience, you then have this opportunity, which direction do you want to take? And I kind of got to the point where I thought there's a lot of people who've got a lot more R&D experience and really quite passionate about getting out of bed for this. And I couldn't quite see that level of enthusiasm for doing the R&D versus perhaps the same level of enthusiasm for doing the commercial side. So I then probably stayed more on the commercial side for a number of years, taking on roles of greater seniority, more opportunity, greater scope. But then realised actually I quite like the R&D. I'd like to go back and dabble in that. So went back then to taking on roles where potentially had both opportunities to take on running R&D programs, as well as potentially country management, other things like that. So the way I kind of describe it is tick tock. So I'd kind of go like this and pendulum, and then it was natural eventually to say, well, you've got a breadth now, just do the whole lot. And so then move into executive leadership. And so that's really how I ended up where I am today.
Yeah, fabulous. So when we alluded to your versatility when introducing you, and like you, I've had the chance to manage across various regions and different types of teams, different types of people. I want to ask what's been the most, I don't know, surprising leadership experience you've had?
Oh, surprising. I could. So I used to run a team of business unit heads that effectively encompassed all of the world except the US and the European Union. There's a group called the International Markets. And as you can imagine, that covered 16 time zones.
Yeah.
And a very diverse group of people, very diverse group of business. I mean, it was focused in one therapeutic area, but essentially, though, you have people from Japan, Australia,
Yeah.
Russia, Turkey, Canada, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and bits in between. And I can remember running my leadership team meetings, and again, because we had this variety of people across the world, I would have a leadership meeting in one hemisphere and a leadership team in there. So I can remember one leadership team in Mexico where we were doing a team building session, and it was my fault. I hadn't quite read the agenda for what we were going to be doing. And so I knew that we were going to do a cookery type thing where people were being involved and had to collaborate and put together this thing. But I didn't realize that one of the dishes that we were making were a local delicacy, which was roasted locusts. And being the chef, and then obviously then being the leader and being the person I had to try the first locust that was being cooked. So that was a very big surprise on quite an early part of that journey. there's a corollary to that story which we can come on to as well. But I then, for the next meeting, I did read the agenda, and the next meeting was actually in Asia, and we just had a lunch there. And again, I thought, yeah, it's fine, it's not, it's a reasonable restaurant. But the my assistant had been absolutely brilliant and had arranged, a local delicacy again. And the local delicacy was, let's say, something that only locals would consider a delicacy.
What was it?
So when it did arrive, I mean, I'll say what it was. It was a fertilized egg that had been cooked in a soup. So when you broke open the egg, there was a chick that had been cooked. A local delicacy. Um, and again, for a leadership thing, I thought, you know what, I could see a certain horror on people's faces. And I thought at this point, this is probably one above my pay grade here to be the first person to take this one. And I said, ladies and gents, if this doesn't quite meet your sensibilities, feel free to leave this. And I think one person attempted it, and then the rest just moved on to the next course.
How horrific. Did you actually eat the locust though?
I did eat the locust,
Oh,
and it would be
was.
wrong to say it tasted of chicken, because everything that is unknown tastes of chicken. It definitely did not taste of chicken. It just it just tasted of crunchy whatever, and you kind of had a drink and swallowed it, and then that was, yeah, interesting, surprising.
Yeah, congratulations. I'm not sure I would have, but so with this big range of experiences, I want to ask: do you consciously adapt your style when working with, let's say, a medical team, regulatory team, to a commercial team? Do you change the way you lead those teams?
I'd say in general, probably yes. I think there's certain conscious things that you do and certain subconscious things you do. I do think though it's a generalism. I think more you actually deal with the people in front of you.
Yeah,
Some of those people, I'd say, you'd expect certain qualities if you look at the role profiles of, let's say, a sales team versus, let's say, a medical affairs team. But you can see commonalities across them as well. Both of them are customer facing. So, you expect them to have the ability to be that customer focused, customer facing. How they deal with things, absolutely very different. Expectations then you can set which are very common, but I'd say how to get the best out of them. You obviously need to reflect their style, their kind of MO. And so I'd say I'm probably more extrovert in commercial teams,
yeah, okay,
which is very interesting for me, not necessarily my default.
yeah,
And I would tend to be more analytical, reflective in more of the R&D medical teams, which is probably slightly easier for me coming from a medical background. But you learn those skills as well,
yeah,
how to adapt, how to be flexible. And it's really, again, you're dealing with an audience, so you have to reflect that audience as well.
yeah, yeah, completely. I want to talk a bit about Medellin, Selwyn.
Hmm.
I first visited Medellin down in Martins Reed, just outside Munich, maybe 8, 9 years ago. And I remember thinking back then when I met one of the executives, this was already a company with a really interesting and kind of varied past that had been through one or two iterations already.
Hmm.
You took over, I think, around 2 years ago. What did you inherit, and how did you sort of formulate your plans for the company?
Sure. Um, what I inherited was a fantastic organization based on incredible science. I think when you probably visited, Medellin as a company had bought out a spin out from the Helmholtz University called Trianta. So had just turned into um, a cell therapy expert company, and it's focusing on T cell receptor T cell therapy, so autologous cell therapies. It still had a legacy business at that point, which was trying to divest and becoming a pure play. So by the time I joined, it was pure play cell therapy,
Yeah.
which was great because the science is incredibly strong, the technology is strong, the IP that's been generated is amazing. Dolores, who was the previous CEO, who led this Trianta, which was the spin-out company, had done an amazing job. Unfortunately, the market had shifted. So, whereas I say 5-6 years ago, there was big interest in cell therapies, particularly after the advent of the first CAR T therapies. TCR-T therapies are going to be the next wave of very interesting cellular therapies. But because of the time they've taken, I think COVID probably got in the way in terms of delaying things for 2 or 3 years. We saw the interest drop off from investors, from big pharma. So when I joined, a very strong foundation is what I inherited, but there was, in my view, a need to move the strategy forward that would allow us to have opportunities where the new wave of interest for whatever the therapies were going to be, in the immuno-oncology space at least, were going to go. And so that was being part of the journey for myself and the company to take it on that journey. And, we probably succeeded early this year. We announced that we were moving into antibody-based therapies.
Yeah.
And that's to complement the cell therapies. And we made that a proposition very real with announcement of a deal we did with Wuxi Biologics in August of this year. And so we're bringing our expertise in developing what we call the T cell receptor, which is effectively the binder that identifies the cancer antigen with a huge level of precision, better than anything else that nature can do. And we then are going to attach those to antibodies. So rather than having them on T cells, which is where historically our expertise has been, we'll be putting those now on antibodies. And we can develop a range of antibody-based therapies off that could extend well beyond what we call these T cell receptor, T cell engagers into other therapies. And that's an area that seems to be a lot of interest from potential partners, etc. More so than cell therapies. Yeah. It's almost that we're probably ahead of our time again with cell therapies. That will come back in, I'm sure, at some point. And we remain committed to cellular therapies, but we need to navigate this interim period.
How difficult was it to get the key people and the company to come with you on this transition?
Great question. I actually started with the board. I think as part of the diligence they were doing when they were talking to me and I was doing coming in, I felt it was really important to kind of outline what I felt was the journey. As you know, no boards like surprises from their CEOs. So, that process, I felt was very important to make sure that this was a journey that we wanted to go into. At the time I joined, Medigene had done a very, very important deal with BioNTech, who were the darlings at the time, having made the COVID vaccine. And that gave us a runway for about 2 years for us to get everything in place. And so it was, okay, so how do we use this opportunity, and discussing with the board over the next 2 years to be able to get us in a position where we have a longer term future. Biotech's life is consistently around financing, executing. And so got the board into discussions, laid out the plans, got them on board. Obviously, as part of that, I'd spoken to Dolores, the incumbent CEO at the time, and laid out what was her thinking, what was her ideas. And so we meshed those together, and she could see that this was potentially an important part. And then the final part of that was to get external validation, because the way I say it all the time is, especially in biotech, whoever writes the checks determines a lot of what we do. And so speaking to potential investors, etc., trying to find out what was going to be of value. It allowed us to have a data set that was compelling,
Yeah.
and dealing with an R&D organization, you need to be data based. You can't have opinion. You've got to be data, got to be factual. And so it was good to get that. And I would say that's a very important part of who I am as well, being kind of an analytical person. I don't I don't not like opinion. I prefer data over opinion.
Yeah. Okay. You touched on something there that's interesting to me, which is the mix of internal focus into the company you're leading and external to those critical stakeholders. Is it 50-50, or what's the right balance for a chief executive like you?
I'd say always, and I think it does vary if you're a publicly listed company versus a private company.
Yeah.
How externally focused you need to be. I think certainly for a publicly listed company, the demands on the external focus are greater. Um, I think also it depends where you are in any given financing life cycle.
Yeah.
Certainly, if we are clear about what financing we need to do, I'll be out on non-deal roadshows, and then if we're announcing that we're financing on deal roadshows, speaking to investors all the time.
Yeah.
Certainly, as part of the life of any biotech as well, there's dealing with potential partners. So it's either yourself as the CEO who's doing it. I realized that actually it would be incredibly helpful to build more of that capabilities in Medellin. So I hired an excellent BD person who's taken on a lot of those responsibilities, and I just come in at the important points or review, as necessary. But they're a lot of the groundwork for, let's say, search and evaluation or the actual business development or alliance management piece. I leave to that team.
Yeah.
And I'd say when you're in a stronger position on the financing, you try and be a little bit more internally focused, and that's where you're looking at your processes and systems. How can you improve these things? And particularly, I say around the process and systems as it relates to culture, because I think that's one of the most important.
Is that something you've had to pay a lot of attention to at Medellin? Do you feel you've changed the culture in any way? How important is company culture, and what do you do to drive that at Medellin?
Okay. I think culture is critically important. It's often said, it sounds trite, it is true. People are your biggest asset.
Yeah.
You don't get anything done without your people. And in an R&D organization, just as it is in a commercial organization, it's those people that are absolutely core. And so having the culture that you believe is the right culture to take the company in the right direction is critical. Um, what's needed to drive it? Well, it depends on what your starting point is. I think, when I joined, we had a very good company culture. In many ways, the company culture has been described as familial. There's a lot of people who've had long tenure, who've joined Medellin as part of the spin out from Trienta. So people know the people well. There's a lot of trust in that.
Yeah.
So that's something you kind of want to keep, that element. I think where company cultures often have to evolve is have to reflect the market environment and the changing dynamics. And we've gone through probably the most difficult financing environment as an industry in the past 35 years, as a biotech industry at least. And so there have to be changes that reflect that environment. And, I think we mentioned earlier, one of those things was to move the company into a direction where we're not just focused on cellular therapies, but actually onto antibody therapies. And there it's critical to bring people along. And, the journey there was, well, one of our core expertises was making these T cell receptors, but we don't have antibody experience. So do we want to become an antibody house? No. That's, you'd need 20 people, you'd need hundreds of years of cumulative experience.
Yeah.
But partnering was a great opportunity to do that using our core expertise. So really refining with the teams, what do we stand for? What do we mean? When I talk to our corp dev teams and I talk to my executive team a lot, I say the single biggest question we can ever ask ourselves that defines who we are and therefore what our culture will be is, why do we as a company deserve to exist?
Great question.
If you can answer that question, then you can set everything in motion around that. What is the people? What are the skill sets? What are the culture?
Yeah.
What are our internal capabilities versus our external capabilities? What do we have in the tank now versus what do we need to improve?
Yeah. So I have to ask, why does Medigene deserve to exist?
Because it is the company that can create, we believe, the most extraordinary T cell receptors that could be used across a range of what we would call TCR guided modalities for the treatment of patients with solid tumors.
Tick. So
You can
what
see I
else?
practiced that one a few times.
That wasn't one of our scripted questions,
I
though. That
know.
was really well done. I want to talk about all these rich cumulative experiences that you've had. How would you boil that down into describing your leadership philosophy today?
Okay. Mentioned some of them already, but first of all, do the right thing. Always. Always. And you will face some really difficult dilemmas. And the true definition of a dilemma is two equally bad decisions that you can choose from. But do the right thing. If
Yeah.
all else is equal, do the right thing.
Yeah.
I think I've said this, never ask anyone to do something that you would not be prepared to do yourself.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
If you cannot justify you taking the hit, having the difficult conversation,
Yeah.
whatever, absolutely, you must do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Integrity. Walk the talk. I think that you can see related themes here. Walk the talk.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And realize that you're going to get it wrong. And therefore, you're going to have to seek counsel. And that leads to the final one, which is actually one of the lessons I learned really early on. You don't have to be right or seem to be right to get the right outcome.
Yeah.
The outcome is more important. That was a gentle reminder from one of my mentors who gently took me to one side and said, "You're right, but if you don't get the right outcome because you haven't influenced the people properly,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter."
Brilliant. So when we're both experienced enough to know what it was like leading people 20 years ago, I feel that society, the way people communicate, it changes so rapidly. Do you feel that the leader of 2024 is necessarily quite different to the leader of 2004?
I definitely think there are differences, yes. But I think it's your leadership is a cumulative experience based leadership. You've learned from what's gone before you. You've learned therefore from the environment that you've been in. So you have to accept that there will be differences now if you're a leader of 10 years now versus if you're a leader of 40 years. The question is if you're a leader of 30 or 40 years, not quite 40, Simon, by the way, not quite 40.
Neither of
But
us.
if you're a leader of 30 years, you've seen different cohorts of time where certain things were considered de rigueur or important and now are less important.
Yeah.
And you have to reflect that. You've also got a workforce now that has different expectations.
Yeah.
And you're always trying to balance those.
Yeah.
I think I said this earlier, be data focused though. Don't be opinion based.
Yeah.
I can bring opinions to the table all the time. But if I'm going to make decisions that are important as a leader, that I believe they have to be fully data based.
Yeah. Excellent. So finally, a few kind of quick fire questions, short, sharp questions for short, sharp answers. What's the best part of your job?
Speaking to people who know more about something than I do, because I learn something every day. I go, wow, didn't know that. That's fantastic.
Fabulous. What's the biggest pain?
Travel.
Okay. I'm going to keep a list of these. Lisa Anson said lawyers. Lawyers travel. Does anything keep you up at night about your work, Selwyn?
Um, yes, it's not a fear of failing. It's not wanting to fail for your people.
Yeah. Okay. That responsibility. In a single word, or maybe two, what defines really great leadership?
Integrity, managing change.
Excellent. Very clear. Um, can you name a leader in any walk of life who you find inspiring?
Um, Previously, yes. At the moment, I'd have to think about it, but I was a big fan of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Okay. Can you expand on why?
Yeah, I mean, she was obviously just a renowned Supreme Court judge on the US Supreme Court. But if you read back into her journey of how she had to traverse um, the early parts of her career as a woman in a very male dominated world,
Yeah.
and then taking that experience and empathy into her decisions, probably on the more liberal side of the Supreme Court. I thought it was an absolutely amazing journey for her.
Yeah. What a great answer. What about a company, perhaps in life sciences or perhaps outside life sciences, that you would admire?
I think in life sciences, not just because they're one of our partners, but because I've known them for a long, long time. Regeneron.
Okay.
I think it's a great company. There have been very few companies that have gone through being from a small biotech to being a big biotech to now being part of the furniture as big pharma.
Yeah.
They are one of them. I mean, and they have had what I would call two world class products come um, out of their discovery and R&D engine, which I have looked at from afar, having worked in the same therapeutic areas, and mightily impressed with what they've done.
Great. Great answer. Okay, my final question, Selwyn. So, if you had to give one piece of advice to an executive stepping into a CEO role for the first time, what is that piece of advice?
Same piece of advice I actually got when I was a kid, um, which I still think is relevant today. You have two ears and one mouth. Do twice as much listening as talking.
Yeah, yeah, great. My granddad said that to me as
Yeah.
well.
The amount of things you can learn, because some people think they have an expectation to know it all, to do it
Yeah,
all, to be right the whole time. That's not the case. It's
yeah,
absolutely not the case.
yeah,
Just find out and listen, and be just happy, ask questions and listen.
yeah. Fabulous. So, and you know what? I think your achievements in the industry kind of speak for themselves, and they are immediately impressive. But what I've really enjoyed is actually listening to what sits behind those, and the experiences that have formed your leadership views, both inside work and outside work. And I love that. I think a great interview, really fascinating answers, and thank you for sharing with us. I'm sure our viewers and listeners are gonna learn a great deal from hearing you. So thank you.
No, thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for the opportunity, and it's quite interesting to kind of reflect on the journey as well. So thank you for that opportunity as well.
Great. So, and best of luck with Medellin and with everything else that you're involved in. Thanks again.
Thanks, Simon.